first time someone told me their name is Poppy, I thought they were joking. I was like, Poppy? It's a cute name, but it's not real.
Not real. Okay, FYI, I'm now sending the stream. It's poor, so might not be able to.
You're sending the stream and then it turns out the second after you said it as if they knew.
Is there any sugar?
There is, but you have to go bang on door number 1 and ask 40 for some.
Thank you. Door number 1 or door number 4?
One.
This is number 1.
Oh, this is number 1, number 4 then.
Number 4, yeah.
Whichever one the office is, knock on that one. That's my advice. Dish. Right. Error. YouTube is not receiving enough video to maintain smooth streaming. As such, viewers will experience buffering. Well, that is sad.
That's Ruth alright, by the way. I texted her a while ago. She normally within an age.
I haven't spoken to her in a long time, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
You know what this is?
I had an idea for Cornerstone. Maybe it's a mother or something else. That would explain.
All right, everybody. We have to be getting started now. So if we could shut that door there, we'll let latecomers join us, but we have to start. I'm having some technical difficulties with the stream, partly because of the internet, which I suspect might have a coronavirus or something. We missed last week. Sorry about that. I had a horrendous cold, maybe a coronavirus too. And now I feel better, so we'll carry on with our view through Isaiah. But I wanted to take some minutes at the beginning, after I've prayed, to review what we've learned so far. So we'll do that as we go on. So Father, I thank you that you and your power and purpose are the whole focus of our morning today. Thank you that you yourself are working in our hearts to change us and to shape us into the right thing. And I pray, Lord God, that you would open the eyes of our heart today, so as we study the book of Isaiah in all of its rich complexity, that you would show us what you are like, and you'd help us make contact with you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
So, what we have been finding is that Isaiah has been presented in a series of what we could call acts, like the same way that a Shakespeare play would have Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. And each act comes with some speakers who voice the issues of the text, and God answers and contributes as a speaker. And usually the acts begin and end quite clearly. We saw that the death of King Uzziah was the sort of heralding of the second act, after Isaiah goes to heaven, and then the death of King Manasseh has happened now. And we will see the events as they unfold. And in terms of a timeline, we're still talking about things that Isaiah was writing about during his own time. So he's talking about kings and people and invasions and stuff that were happening in real time to him. And what he's doing is he's explaining to everybody what God thinks about it. And how would you sum up Isaiah's main message about the invasions, particularly about Assyria, which is happening in his lifetime? What's Isaiah telling everybody to do about Assyria?
Keep calm, not to worry.
Keep calm and carry on. Don't worry. Good point. So everybody else is thinking, how are we going to keep the kingdom intact? And Isaiah says the kingdom itself is definitely going to fall. Israel itself is not going to be this David-style kingdom again. There will be a branch from the root of the stump of Jesse. There will be an heir to follow the promise. God will always be true to all of his promises, but you've got to just get on board with being invaded and taken over, because that's the deal for now. And even though in Isaiah's lifetime that takes the form of Assyria being the main agitator, Isaiah also speaks extensively about Babylon. Now, Babylon in that time actually suffered a defeat to Assyria. Assyria beat up Babylon, sacked Babylon itself, defeated their army, and Assyria seems like nobody can stop them. But Isaiah actually curses Babylon in the text, and quite a lot of the last chunk, especially the second half of it that we read, was about Babylon being cursed. Now, we know that later on, long after Isaiah's dead, Babylon is also going to rise up and then take over the kingdom of Israel, kingdom of Judah. But Isaiah doesn't know that. So we find these strange glimpses into a future that Isaiah can't have known about. And we've acknowledged that there are skeptics who say, well, that just means it was changed afterwards. Or it just means it was written afterwards and added on at the end. But as we will see, that isn't going to deal with the text itself. That's not fair on the text of Isaiah, which has been faithfully preserved so meticulously over history that would be absurd. So whatever it is, we know that by about 200 BC, there are Hebrew and Greek copies of Isaiah, which are always as a single scroll. We know the Hebrew from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we've discovered. We know the Greek from the Septuagint, which most of the Judeans at the time were using. Certainly the writers of the New Testament were using it mostly. And Isaiah is a single scroll. So if you want to make the argument that Isaiah was edited and patched together by all sorts of people, then you're going to have to come up with some pretty good arguments, because people used to argue that might not have been a complete one text of Isaiah until after Jesus came, but the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was what changed the argument. Now, we're going to go into Act 3 today, and still in a way, Ahaz is dead and Hezekiah is on the throne. This is still in Isaiah's lifetime. So in the beginning of Isaiah, it says, this is the vision of Isaiah, son of Amos, which he saw during the reign of these four kings. So Hezekiah is one of these kings. And we're going to notice that he doesn't name Hezekiah in this section at all, even though most of the events are to do with it. And partly that's because of his overall message, which is, don't worry about being invaded and taken over, because there's nothing you can do to stop it. Isaiah's going to track with those groups of people who are trying to stop it. Some of them are going to reach out to other kingdoms and say, you're powerful, defend us. A bit like when there's trouble in the Middle East today, like a Middle Eastern country will reach out to usually Russia or the United States or maybe France or the UK and say, help us, we're being invaded, get them. And, then an aircraft carrier steams in, and jets and nuclear, well, maybe not nuclear missiles, but, we ring the big countries when we're in trouble because we've been antagonistic with our neighbours. So this was still happening in these days. So the superpowers of the time really are Assyria, Egypt, and Persia. Persia is not really that interested at this point. They're hands off, whatever, guys, you don't worry about it. Persia will rise up in the future, and so will Greece, and so will Rome, but they're not really in view here in Isaiah. We're talking about Assyria mostly. We've scorned Babylon, and we're going to hear more about Egypt this section. So what I'm going to do is read the first part. Actually, if you turn in your booklets to page 17, it says, where an introduction to Act 3. It says, the third act of Isaiah speaks to a troubled time after Ahaz's death, where Hezekiah's ministers give bad counsel until they are dismissed at the end of the act. So instead of the death of the king, the act is going to end when Hezekiah's chief ministers are all fired, basically. That's what Isaiah writes. So Ahaz does die around 715 BC. That's 715 years before Jesus' birth, but we think Jesus was probably born around 4 BC. More on that another time. And at this point, Assyria is lulling after having defeated and sacked Babylon. In 710 BC, Egypt is in considerable disarray, and emissaries from a still independent kingdom like Moab and Cush are coming to Israel. Hezekiah is not named at all in this act, which is a surprise given Isaiah himself undoubtedly lived through this period. Hezekiah's successes and his reforms, which you can read about in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles and Proverbs, are well documented in the scripture, but Isaiah breezes right past them. Effectively, he accuses Hezekiah and the royal ministers of presumption before God and hubris. So what Isaiah says is all your reforms and all your attempts to get the kingdom back on track really are ignoring the main problem, which is that we're all going to definitely have to be defeated by Assyria. So you're trying hard because you know you've hardly got any time left, but in the end that's not going to change the ultimate outcome. Hezekiah only enters the scene himself at the point of the disaster when God intervenes, and we're not going to find out about that till chapter 36. Okay, so all of Hezekiah's efforts until then are just going to be almost completely ignored by the text, even though he's trying really hard to shuffle cards and win friends and reach out to other things, and he's doing a lot of wrong as well. It's not till Hezekiah gets ill and has his miracle that he starts getting things on track properly. At first he's much more sort of trying to get by.
Isn't Cush the same as Egypt?
Egypt is not the same as Cush, no. The geography of the Nile River region changes a lot over the time that the Old and New Testaments exist. So ancient Egypt ruled from the Nile Delta pretty much all the way down the Nile up until the Nile's, the 2 tributaries, the blue and the white. They ruled over that area as well, and basically the Blue Nile goes into the mountains of Ethiopia, which Egypt never really ruled over, and the White Nile goes all the way down into the jungles of Central Africa, also which Egypt kind of reached and then thought, forget this, too many mosquitoes, we'll stay this part of the river. So ancient Egypt variously ruled over all of that segment. Sometimes there was a northern lower kingdom and a southern upper kingdom. So it was 2 kingdoms for a while. Then it was like Egypt again, united kingdoms, but it was a lot smaller. And at this stage, Egypt is basically a single kingdom, and it rules over most of it. But Cush is the kingdom on its southern border. So Cush is sort of half Ethiopia, half Sudan, basically. That's kind of where we are. And they are sometime friends of Egypt and sometime enemies. The other major ones in Africa are the Libyans, or Put, which they're the kind of Saharan neighbours of Egypt, and they're further along the coast on North Africa. So Egypt has sort of Cush and Put and a couple of other smaller kingdoms in Africa as its neighbours, but its other border is with Judah and Israel, and Assyria is past there. So one of the things that happens repeatedly throughout history is Egypt will occasionally conquer the Sinai Desert and rule over the whole of what is now Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, places like that. And then they keep it as like a buffer kingdom, so that if someone like Assyria or Sumer or Akkadians or Babylonians or someone, if they ever challenge Egypt, Egypt's got a little bit of a buffer zone to defend themselves and their real territory, which is all in Africa, obviously. So Israel and Judah are used to being used as a pawn. At the time of the conquest of Canaan under Joshua, Egypt would have been the ruler of the zone, more or less. And that's the time when these small kingdoms like Israel pop up, and because it's a lull in the powers of Egypt and Assyria and Babylon and the other countries around there. So in Isaiah's time, Cush is Egypt's southern neighbour. They're sending emissaries to Israel and to Assyria to basically see who they can be friends with and how they can get more power. Any more questions about geography and the wheres and whens and such?
That was awesome, thank you.
Potted history of late Bronze Age and Iron Age geopolitics. Sorry about that. We're going to begin with what Isaiah says about Moab. We noticed Moab is one of the eastern neighbours of Israel, of Judah, and they're a smaller kingdom, and Isaiah's going to talk to them a lot about what they have done. And in fact, we're going to read all the way through chapter 15 to halfway through chapter 16. In fact, all of chapter 16.
Talks about the lions from there as well coming.
The what, sorry?
The lions coming from there as well.
Lions coming from Moab.
18, 19, 20.
In these days, there would have been lions and populations of lions which were either like Asiatic lions, like in India and Iran, or the African lions, all the way through this region up to Turkey. So they're in the more civilized areas, they obviously would have killed the lions off and ruled them out, but lions sort of would have been roving around and occasionally set upon the area, and that's where they come from for Israel. Okay, chapter 15 then, verse 1. An oracle concerning Moab. See, because Ar of Moab is laid waste in a night, Moab is undone. Because Kir of Moab is laid waste in a night, Moab is undone. He has gone up to the temple and to Dibon, to the high places to weep over Nebo and Medeba. Moab wails. Upon every head is baldness, every beard is shorn. In the streets they wear sackcloths, on the housetops and in the squares everybody wails and melts in tears. Heshbon and Eliah cry out, their voice is heard as far as Jehaz. And there the armed men of Moab cry aloud, and their soul trembles. Nobody cries for Moab. His fugitives flee to Zoar, to Eglath-Shisheliah. For at the ascent of Luhith they go up weeping, on the road to Horonaim they raise a cry of destruction. The waters of Nimrim are a desolation, and the grass is withered, the vegetation fails, the greenery is no more. Therefore the abundance they have gained, and what they have laid up, they carry away. Over the brook of the willows, for a cry has gone around the land of Moab, and wailing reaches to Eglaim. His wailing reaches to Beer Elim, for the waters of Dibon are full of blood. Or I will bring upon Dibon even more, a lion for those of Moab who escape, for the remnant of the land. So send the lamb to the ruler of the land, from Selah by the way of the desert, to the mountain on the daughter of Zion. Like fleeing birds, like a scattered nest, these are what the daughters of Moab are like, on the fords of the Arnon. Give counsel, grant justice, and make your shade like night at the height of noon. Shelter the outcasts, and do not reveal the fugitive. Let the outcasts of Moab sojourn amongst you. Be a shelter to them from the destroyer. When the oppressor is no more, and the destruction has ceased, then the one that tramples underfoot has vanished from the land. Then a throne will be established in steadfast love, and on it will sit in faithfulness in the tent of David, one who judges and seeks justice and is swift to do righteousness. We have heard of the pride of Moab, how proud he is, of his arrogance, of his pride, of his insolence, of his idle boasting. He is not right. Therefore let Moab cry for Moab. Let everybody wail, mourn utterly stricken for the raisin cakes of Kir-Hareseth. For the fields of Heshbon languish, and the vine of Sibmah. The lords of the nations have struck down the branches which reach to Jazer, and stray to the desert. Its shoots spring abroad and passed over the sea, and therefore I will weep with the weeping of Jazer for the vine of Sibmah. I will drench you with my tears, O Heshbon and Eliah. For you, your summer fruit, and your harvest, the shout has ceased. The joy and gladness are taken away from the fruitful field, and in the vineyard no songs are sung, no cheers are raised, no tread of wine is in the wine presses. I have put an end to the shouting. Therefore my inner parts moan like a lyre for Moab, and my inmost self for Kir-Hareseth. And when Moab presents himself, when he wearies himself on the high place, when he comes to the sanctuary to pray, he will not prevail. This is the word that the Lord spoke concerning Moab in the past, but now the Lord has spoken, saying, in 3 years like the years of a hired worker, the glory of Moab will be brought into contempt, into spite of all the great multitude, and those who remain will be very few and feeble. So, big trouble for Moab. Now, I know that as a 21st century reader, it's actually quite hard to deal with a text like this. I mean, if you counted how many place names and things you didn't understand in that passage, it'd be nearly 100, wouldn't it? What Isaiah's doing is he's describing Moab. So the vineyards, the green fields, the towns, the cities, villages, roads, and people are all from Moab. And what he's doing is basically like if you were doing a lament for Dorset, you would be saying, oh, poor old Weymouth, the Fleet Lagoon is now gone to bad sewage water, and poor old Chickerell, it will never see its little farmland thrive again, and as for Bowley's Cove, it'll all fall into the sea, and it'll all be terrible. So that's what Isaiah is doing. He's describing the destruction of Moab, and we actually have found some very interesting archaeological evidence from Moab. So if you flip over your page onto page 18 there, you can see this Moabite stone, which is the first mention of the God of Israel which came from outside of Israel. So the Moabite stone chronicles some of the kings of Israel and Judah. So it says, Omri was the king of Israel, and he oppressed Moab, and I took the vessels of Yahweh. That's what this stone says. You can find this in the Louvre, and it sort of shows a Moabite king who chronicles an interaction with Israel. Israel as the northern kingdom now is pretty much completely kaput, and Omri was from a generation before Isaiah ever lived. But Moab now is in big trouble. So King Omri and King Ahab of the northern kingdom of Israel are both mentioned in this stone, and it's, like I said, at the Louvre now, which you can still see. Really interesting. So the passage contains several speakers. I bet it was hard to follow and figure out who was speaking, but basically there's a messenger from Moab who's telling everybody what's happening in Moab, to Shebna, who is the king's official. And Shebna's the one who is answering the emissary. And the emissary is pleading for aid. Have a look at 16 verses 3 to 4 again. I'll just read that and this might make it a bit clearer. So chapter 16 verses 3 to 4. Give counsel, grant justice, make your shade like night at the height of noon. Shelter the outcasts, do not reveal the fugitive. Let the outcasts of Moab sojourn amongst you. Be a shelter to them from the destroyer. When the oppressor is no more and the destruction is ceased, and he who tramples underfoot has vanished from the land, and a throne will be established in steadfast love, and it will be on the tent of David. So the messenger from Moab says, let the refugees from Moab please come into Judah. Okay, we're running away from this terrible destruction. Moab is being digested by Assyria, and there's a load of refugees who want to leave Moab and take shelter in Judah for a while, in Jerusalem. And this emissary is saying, let them in, and then when the war's over and the oppressor is gone and the Assyrians have finished destroying us, we'll leave. We'll head back. But we want you to give us shelter. We want you to have like an umbrella over the top of us that shades us from the noonday heat. We want somewhere to be able to stay so that we can survive this terrible thing. What should Judah do? Judah should let... Why do you say that?
Well, I was thinking like they were fugitives. It doesn't say like in the law that they should take them. Like if others are like on the run, they should take them in.
Good. So there's the Torah, the law says that if there's aliens and foreigners and sojourners amongst you, you're to be neighbourly to them, you're to be kind to them, you're to provide for them as part of the community, and make sure that if there's hungry people in your town, that you're feeding them. That's what it says. So Israel, or more properly Judah, if they're reading their Bibles and doing well, then that's what they'll do, and that's what the king will decide. But Isaiah says within 3 years, unfortunately, it's basically going to be completely and utterly wiped. Moab never really recovers after this. It never becomes a people or a kingdom ever again. Assyria does a job of basically destroying all of its civil structures, planting its own, i.e. Assyria's, and scattering the people. So Assyria were big fans of what is now called ethnic cleansing or genocide. So they think, well, we're eating up a small kingdom. What we don't want is some future king arising afterwards to revivify this kingdom. So we'll wipe them out, scatter them, put Assyrian settlers into the same land, and then we'll just basically erase all trace of this kingdom. And that's what they did. So Isaiah says, look, we've got to let these refugees in, because this emissary is there saying, come on, we've got thousands of people who have nowhere to be, we've lost everything, we should let them in, because that's what we should do, because Moab's been laid waste and it's not their fault. But we shouldn't be under any illusions about trying to help them get back on their feet as a kingdom, because that's gone. God is judging Moab.
Is verse 5 a foreshadowing for Christ on the throne, or is that...
Verse 5 of chapter 16?
Yeah.
Good. So then a throne will be established in steadfast love, and on it will sit in faithfulness in the tent of David, one who judges and seeks justice and is swift to do righteousness. Well, excuse me. Verse 16, verse 1 says, send the lamb to the ruler of the land. We're talking about a bit of a sacrifice offering here. So offer a lamb as a sacrifice, saying, let's just talk. By the way, the desert, to the mountain of the daughter of Zion, which is Jerusalem itself. We're like fleeing birds. Please give counsel. Please cover us over like night at the shade of noon. We're outcasts of Moab. When the oppressor's gone, we'll come back. Then a throne will be established in steadfast love, and on it will sit in faithfulness in the tent of David, one who judges and seeks justice and is swift to do righteousness. So Moab is saying, if you do this, then your throne is going to be made greater, because you'll be the kind king that saved the refugees of Moab. So there's a sense of immediate fulfillment in that's what's being offered to the king. You know, like, then we'll all say David's tent is still up, and you know, there's still one of his sons sitting on it because you're in righteousness and stuff, if you let us in. So that's the immediate fulfillment. And remembering our, what do we call it, a hermeneutic of multiple fulfillment.
Yeah.
Can someone describe the hermeneutic of multiple fulfillment? How does that work?
Basically, it gets recycled and reused, just like when with Isaiah 7, how it's on about the king does have a son and his name is Emmanuel, but obviously it's another foreshadowing will be reused when Christ is born, which is what I was asking about, whether that be the same for verse 5.
Good. So a hermeneutic of multiple fulfillment says, even if this is a text that was written by Isaiah about events of Isaiah's own time, we can look at this same text through the lens of multiple fulfillment and say it's possible for it to still keep coming true long after everybody concerned has died. So a bit like the water cycle, the rain comes down, it waters the earth, it runs to the sea, it evaporates up, it comes down, it waters the earth, it goes to the sea. And that cycle is a way of describing how the word of God could be living and active, that it could be alive somehow by coming true more than one time. So yes is the short answer. This is Isaiah is including this as part of the text of his scriptural document. So even though the speaker is an ungodly barbarian, basically, his words are part of the text of scripture. And there are so many other things that have it. Now, not all words from not all speakers can be used in this way properly, I don't think. Sometimes it'd be wrong to just pluck things out and just say, yeah, this is a thing I can do through multiple fulfillment. But whenever it speaks to a future that hasn't happened yet, it's a bit like the moment of the speech says there is a future which is not decided yet, but it could be this. You can use those kinds of texts for our hermeneutic of multiple fulfillment. But if I use a text that says, out of the window there is an elephant, if there was such a text in the Bible. I wouldn't be able to just kind of say that and say, out of the window there's an elephant, look. It's like, well, yeah, but there's not. But if the Moabite is given shelter and counsel, then the throne of tent of David may be re-established and set up. Interestingly, Jesus has a Moabite in his ancestry. Do you know who that is? Ruth. Good. Yeah, so Matthew's chronology of the ancestors of Jesus as an earthly person show several dodgy women in the ancestry. First of all, Mary, I guess, who would be dodgy because of the scandal of the conception. But she wasn't the only one. There's also Tamar, who was tricking the patriarch Judah to have children with her. There was Rahab, the Jerichoite prostitute. There's
Is that the one that saved
the two spies from Canaan. Yeah, that's right. So she's listed in there too. And Ruth, the Moabitess. And when we studied Ruth in Bible study, we found that actually in the rules of the Bible, David should not have been allowed to be in the area of the altar or the Ark of the Covenant. He couldn't have served in the sanctuary or been in the sanctuary because Moabites were forbidden up to the 10th generation, whereas his great-grandmother was a Moabitess, so he was only 4th-generation Moabite. So really, really interesting how the Bible sort of shows that the rules of the Torah are not there to be only legalistically interpreted. Jesus lists loads of other examples like that. So someone's trying to catch him about fasting and doing things on the Sabbath, and Jesus says, well, look, David, you all like David, right? Well, David went in there and ate the bread of the offering, and he wasn't allowed to, but he did, and you all like him. So maybe we'll get a little bit less litigious and a little bit more about, are the hungry being fed, are the refugees being welcomed, is society being anything like what God wants?
And it's all about helping the needy and poor.
Yeah.
On and on and on.
Help the needy
and poor.
Yeah.
Give thanks to God.
Yeah, so when you're doing the Passover sacrifice, you want one lamb per family, everybody round one table, everybody eat it. And if, by the way, there's a neighbour who's got no family, or somebody who's by themselves, or somebody who can't afford it, bring them into your house. We're all having Passover together. It's very, very important. There's so many things like that all the way through the law of God. And so that's the appeal of Moab. It's like, you, God literally says, be neighbourly, be kind to the sojourner and the exile. Well, here we all are. I've got you. So I won't dive into the political aspects of dealing with global migration and refugees now, because it's probably too tricky of an issue to underpin right now. But I do think it's worth a reflective moment for each of us about whether or not that's the kind of kingdom and country we think we're supposed to live in today. Now then, we're going to go over the page. This is actually a very short section, but the pieces of scripture we're reading are very long, so sorry about that. We're going to go to 17 to 20. So this is a lot of text. I'll stop as we go, and we'll see. We'll probably stop at the end of each section. So he's got a load of oracles, and almost every one of these next few oracles are concerning kingdoms that are in opposition to Assyria. Some of them are small, some of them are big, but all of them we'll find out about. And what you want to see is, let's imagine it's a Shakespeare play. What you've got is the king of Judah on his throne in Jerusalem, and you've got emissaries coming from different countries. So the known world for these guys is extending deep into Africa, partly into Europe, and far into Asia. But the kingdoms concerned are much more sort of local than that. So Cush, as we've said, is sort of Sudan, South Sudan sort of area. The ones in the Middle East here are, they're days away by donkey. They're not the ends of the earth, but they are pretty much as far away as any of these people would be able to think about. They knew about the kingdom of Cush, but none of them is going to have been there, that kind of thing. Traders will have been going up and down the Red Sea since, before Solomon's time, and it's recorded that Solomon welcomed the queen of Shebna, which would be the kind of Ethiopian kind of area. And they knew about Persia, and they knew about an India beyond that. And Alexander the Great, when he conquers, kind of gets that far. So that's their known world. It's like a big circle around Israel of possibly a couple or 3,000 miles. So here we go. Let's go for Damascus first, which is very local to Israel. Damascus is another example of a small kingdom which popped up in the time between the great empires of the Bronze Age and the great empires of the Iron Age, which are now. So Assyria and Babylon, they're coming as serious new technological military powers. But Damascus, in the time in between then and the old kingdoms, is popped up and become a proper city.
Yeah, it's one of the oldest ones, isn't it?
Yeah. Fun fact, actually, Damascus apparently is the oldest city in the world which has been continuously inhabited.
Yeah.
So its first records of people living there would have been thousands of BC.
Which makes it more like shocking when it says that Damascus will be a ruinous heap. So when it's saying, that great city of old that's been there for ancient
They've
days,
seen it all, yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be the wasteland.
Yeah.
And that's almost sort of happened with the war that's been going on.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? The war's not over yet, and I guess enough Russian and American shells will make this come true in a way. But it's interesting that's what Isaiah says, because Damascus has actually allied itself before. You remember reading about Damascus coming together with the northern kingdom of Israel to try and conspire against the Assyrians, and Isaiah's telling the king of Judah this is a bad idea. The northern kingdom and Damascus try and invade Judah and they fail, and that's sort of Isaiah's guarantee that this is what God wants. So, an oracle concerning Damascus. Behold, Damascus will cease to be a city and will become a heap of ruins. The cities of Aroer are deserted. They will be for flocks, which will lie down, and nobody's going to make them afraid. The fortress will disappear from Ephraim, and the kingdom will disappear from Damascus. The remnant of Syria will be like the glory of the children of Israel, declares the Lord of hosts. In that day, the glory of Jacob will be brought low, and the fat of his flesh will get skinny, and it shall be as when the reaper gathers the standing grain. His arm harvests the ears of corn, and as when some gleans the ears in the valley of Rephaim. Gleanings will be left in it, as when an olive tree is beaten. 2 or 3 berries in the top of the highest bough, 4 or 5 on the branches of a fruit tree, declares the Lord God of Israel. In that day, a man will look to his Maker, and his eyes will look on the Holy One of Israel. He will not look to the altars, to the work of his hands, and he will not look on what his own fingers have made, either the Asherim or the altars of incense. And in that day their strong cities will be like the deserted places of wooded heights and hilltops, which they deserted because of the children of Israel, and there will be desolation. For you have forgotten the God of your salvation, and you have not remembered the rock of your refuge. Therefore, though you plant pleasant plants and sow the vine branch of a stranger, though you make them grow on the day you plant them and make them blossom in the morning that you sow, yet the harvest will flee away in a day of grief and incurable pain. Ah, the thunder of many peoples, they thunder like the thundering of the sea. The roar of nations, they roar like the roaring of mighty waters. The nations roar like the roaring of many waters, but he will rebuke them, and they will flee far away. They will be chased like chaff on the mountains before the wind, the whirling dust before the storm. And evening time, behold, terror. Before morning they are no more. This is the portion of those who loot us, and the lot of those who plunder us. So, who's getting plundered? Or who's been being plundered? Isaiah's boys, Judah. So they were invaded by Damascus and the northern kingdom of Israel. And I don't know if you caught it, but there are little curses upon Jacob and upon Israel sewn into this. And what Isaiah is saying is that because you guys charged in and tried to defeat us, you never took Jerusalem, so we were safe, but you have basically raided our whole country. You've looted our farmland and destroyed our farmland, so God's going to loot yours. And he's going to break down your city, and people are going to be leading sheep through your old city streets because there'll be such disaster, because God is going to punish you for attacking Judah. So this happened. Assyria utterly sacks Damascus, and the people left in Damascus, it says, will be like after you shake the olive tree and you knock all the olives down, there's a couple still up there, the gleanings. That's for the poor and the fatherless and the widow.
There's 2 apples on the tree.
Good examples. There's a couple left. That's what it'll be like. There used to be dozens and now there's a couple. There used to be thousands, now it'll just be a few hundred or something. So that's what's going to happen because of what they have done to raise themselves against Judah. So that's the bit. Hey, coming in.
Oh, you
Hiya.
Is that okay?
So my first point on our little sheet here is that the lament over Damascus shows the contrast at the close of the 700s BC between Judah, which is kind of fine, and Damascus and Ephraim, northern Israel. What is God's perspective? What should everybody be doing? So Judah has survived and is fine. Damascus and the northern kingdom are not fine. They are on their way to complete destruction. What does God think? What should people be doing? There's a suggestion in the cursing about what people should do. Can you see it?
Lament and repent,
Yeah, lament and repent. So what God says is, if you look at verse 10 there, you've forgotten the God of your salvation, you haven't remembered the rock of your refuge. Therefore, though you plant pleasant plants and sow vine branches of strangers, so you're kind of doing all your gardening well, you'll make them grow on the day. Even though that happens, the harvest is going to flee away in grief and incurable pain. So you have to turn to God. There's another one, verse 7. In that day, man will look to his Maker, and his eyes will look on the Holy One of Israel. He will not look to the altars or the work of his hands, which means the idols, and he will not look on what his own fingers have made, either the Asherim or the altars of incense. So what Isaiah is promising is that when this destruction happens, people are going to twig and they're going to say, we were wrong to set ourselves up in vanity. We were wrong to plan against Judah. We were wrong to forget the God who made us. And Isaiah is promising that even the northern kingdom, the Samaritans, will rediscover their connection with with God who brought them up out of Egypt. So even though the disaster is coming and there'll hardly be anyone left, the ones that are left are going to experience a bit of a religious turning. They're going to rediscover their faith and they're going to recommit to the truth. It's interesting, archaeologically speaking, the northern kingdom, which became Samaria, the Samaritans of Jesus' time, and the southern kingdom of Judah, the Jews, they both have the Torah. So the Samaritan Pentateuch is a really important archaeological object. It's an ancient copy of the Torah. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They are Israelites. They're the tribes of Israel. They lived there. They still have a Samaritan church of Christians, Samaritan Christians. There still exists a Samaritan Orthodox Christianity. And they still have Samaritan Pentateuch. There still exists. Now, what's different is that the time between the conquest of the land where the Israelites kind of established themselves in Canaan, the time between then and now 700 BC, they've been really, really separate, and the Samaritans record the history very differently. They say it was the supreme arrogance of Judah which made everything center on Judah. Because in the beginning, the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, was not in Jerusalem, was it? It was in other places, Bethel for a while, and what was the other one? Shiloh, yeah.
He got taken away by Canaanites, and then all
the Philistines, yeah.
Yeah.
Good. So that's the point, that in the northern kingdom, it was Jewish Judah arrogance that made all this problem. But the prophets of Judah are all saying, and in fact the prophets of the northern kingdom as well, are saying it's the idolatry of the northern kingdom that's brought this demise. But if you excuse me, If you think you only had the Torah, you could actually, there's nothing in the Torah about Jerusalem. Nothing in the Torah says you have to go down to Jerusalem to celebrate the festivals, is there?
The other thing is the Northern Kingdom after the Assyrian captivity was more ethnically mixed.
That's right. So at this time, what's happening is the whole racial purity or ethnic purity of the Northern Kingdom is almost completely dissolved. So they've been marrying and intermarrying with all of the kind of communities around them. And people have always kind of married for alliances, haven't they? That's an ancient history fact. That's what people do. But that's what's expressly forbidden. And that's one of the things that God condemns them for. So particularly in Hosea and in Amos, the Northern Kingdom is prophesied against as being a nation that mixed up their gods and mixed up their blood. They gave themselves over to vanities and delusions of grandeur when they should have been staying faithful to the Torah, which they knew, and the God which brought them out of Egypt, but they basically become like any one of the other countries, and that's why God's going to destroy them. So we're living in Isaiah's time, in the time where that literally happens, where Assyria completely destroys them. And they kind of never really re-establish as a kingdom, but they do sort of stay on as a kind of legacy factor. But by Jesus' time, the people who live in the Northern Kingdom, the Samaritans, are almost hopelessly non-Israelite by then.
But then you've got the Galileans further north, still further away from Jerusalem, who seem to be part of Israel.
Part of the Roman province of Judea.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Jesus' family are not regarded as Samaritans.
Not regarded as Samaritans, no. No. So Nazareth and Galilee upon the shores of the lake there are sort of the northernmost extent of what became the Roman province of Judea, the territory that was settled by the Jews after the Babylonian exile. The kind of shape of Judah kind of takes place there. Various successive regimes of Persians, then Greeks, then Hasmoneans, then Romans, all sort of edit the borders a little bit to include some of the ancestral lands, all of the ancestral lands, hardly any of the ancestral lands. And in Roman times when Jesus is born, it's right to say that the Galilee and Nazareth are sort of up there on their own, and they're connected by, you have to sort of cross through Samaria to get to the rest of it, to get to Jerusalem. And it's interesting that the text of Isaiah includes the promise that you, Galilee of the Gentiles, land of Zebulun and Naphtali, you're going to see the delight of your eyes in the future. And that kind of came true in Jesus in that way.
I think the Orthodox themselves, the really strict ones, would not pass through Samaria to go up north. They would go across the river to the other side, and cross it again back to go up north.
That's true. So the quickest way from where Jesus was to Jerusalem was to go through Samaria, but the Orthodox Jews, or the ones who wanted to stay holy, would not go through the land of the Samaritans. They would cross the River Jordan into the sort of east coast of the eastern edge of the Jordan Valley there, and go down through Jewish land, and then cross the river again to get to Jerusalem, and therefore not go through the land of the Samaritans. Which is interesting because in John 4, Jesus goes straight through Samaria, doesn't he? And he meets a Samaritan woman, and we all hear about that. But that's the kind of ethnic strife we're talking about here. The setting all has roots in this time here. Hundreds of years passed between then and then. But it's amazing how long that stuff sticks. I mean, if you look at European history, there's still arguments about stuff that happened this long ago.
Ask a stupid question.
There's no such thing as a stupid question. No, yes, there is. Yes, you may.
You said that they weren't allowed, there's no law in the Torah for them to go down to Jerusalem. So my question is, I should know it really, but that's what I'm asking. So what books are all the feast days in that they're meant to celebrate everything?
Well, Jewish feasts were added as sort of throughout the course of Old Testament history. So, for instance, the feast of the Passover, that's in Exodus, isn't it? But the feast itself is no reference to Jerusalem in it. So you get together in your homes, you eat with your coat on, don't you? And you get your stick. And you have your staff, leaned up against your chair, because we're eating, ready to leave. And that's the ceremony.
Yeah, right.
But it's the same for all other, future festivals. They're added when something happens in real time, and then they're commemorated ever after. But the celebrating of things in Jerusalem is something that happens really after David. So David is the one who establishes both the seat of the kingdom in Jerusalem and the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem, the tabernacle. And when the temple is built, that's seen as a sort of job that's done. But Jerusalem itself was not sort of listed in the early festivals as being something that people needed to worry about. In fact, it's not even mentioned in the Torah. I mean, it's possibly the city of Salem that Melchizedek comes out of in Abraham's day, but in terms of Exodus time and the establishment of Israel's first customs and the law itself, that's not about Jerusalem. So Isaiah says that Israel has become like Canaan before Israel came in. Let's do a little study. So you've got Isaiah 17 verses 9 to 14, and I'd like this half of the room to look at that text and note down all the things in Isaiah 17, 9 to 14 that are true about the northern kingdom of Israel. And I'd like this half of the room to look at Exodus 23, verses 20 to 30, and note the things that are true about Canaan. And we're going to see what similarities we can find. So take a few minutes, do it in pairs or threes or something, however many people you can talk to without shouting, and we'll feed our information back in just a moment.
Exodus 23.
Yeah, 23, verses 20 to 30. You can have a Bible if you want.
Well, thank you.
I don't think I'll qualify to do this because I'm still stuck on, I'm doing volume back in Leviticus. So I haven't got to Canaan.
Let's see.
Okay, make your conversations happen. I'm going to turn the recording off, so don't worry about sounding silly while you're in quiet. How are we all doing?
Not really finding many distinctions of the Canaanites.
No distinctive markers or anything like that?
Not really, actually.
Well, let's see where we get then. So, can I swap Bibles with you just so I can... Does anyone else need one who can't see one? This is only the NIV, nearly inspired version. That's a joke. That's a joke. I love the NIV. It's the first version I learned, and it's lovely. I really think it's good, but I like the joke too. So, somebody who was looking at the Exodus passages, just give me anything that sort of describes Canaan as it was. What does it say about it?
They have false gods.
Okay, so they got false gods. That's a big problem.
It's the same thing, isn't it? Time and time over and over again. False gods.
God, a lot of people come back to him.
Mm-hmm. Did you notice what was going ahead of them?
Honest.
There's an angel going ahead of the Israelites when they go into Canaan, and hornets and a storm are going to drive everybody out from before them. So one little known bit of information about the conquest of Canaan is that this plague of locusts that drives the people out kind of does half of the work of getting rid of the people for the Canaanites. So the main opposition they meet is the people in walled cities, so Ai and Jericho, and there's one more I can't remember, and the standing armies of the last few kingdoms that are left. But actually the bulk of the work is done by this terrible plague of biting locust thingies that sort of scares everybody out ahead of the invading army. So tell me about the Isaiah passage, 17 verses 9 to 14. Do you see anything like that?
Cities will be abandoned and they forget God the Saviour.
Mm.
Yeah, they'll be desolate.
So God forsakes the people of the land to prepare the way for the invaders in both cases. Yeah. So in the Exodus passage, it will be Israel entering and Canaan being driven away. But now God says that the same thing's going to happen, but in reverse. You're going to be Northern Kingdom driven out, and the Assyrians are going to come and have the land. Interesting, isn't it? So what's the reason? Well, the iniquity of Canaan is complete once again. God said, I'm not sending you in there now, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, to have the land, because the iniquity of the Canaanites is not complete. You have to wait for the time when it would be right to drive them all out. Normally it's wrong to do that. That's why we don't do it today. Although Britain has done in many cases, which we'll deal with another time. But now God says, look, you're like the Canaanites from Joshua's day. You're giving yourself to idolatry. You've completely forsaken all my word. So I'm going to... Completely evil. I'm going to drive you right out. And it's going to be a storm. Listen to this storm. The nations are all going to roar like mighty waters. It's going to be an enemy you couldn't hope to defeat. It's just going to come and sweep you all away. Interesting. Okay, we're going to move on. And we're going to look at the oracle concerning Cush. Land of whirring wings. That's locusts. That is beyond the rivers of Cush, which sends ambassadors by the sea, in vessels of papyrus upon the waters. Go, you swift messengers, to a nation tall and smooth-skinned, to a people feared near and far, a nation mighty and conquering, whose land the rivers divide. Talking mostly about the Nile there. All you inhabitants of the world, everybody who dwells on the earth, when a signal is raised on the mountains, look, and when the trumpet is blown, listen. For thus the Lord has said to me, I will quietly look from my dwelling place, like clear heat in the sunshine, like a cloud of dew in the heat of the harvest. For before the harvest, when the blossom is over and the flower becomes a ripening grape, He cuts off the roots with pruning hooks, and the spreading branches he lops off and clears away. They shall all of them be left to the birds of prey of the mountains and to the beasts of the earth, and the birds of prey will summer upon them, and all the beasts of the earth will winter on them. And at that time tribute will be brought to the Lord of hosts from this people, tall and smooth-skinned, from a people feared near and far, a nation mighty and conquering, whose land the rivers divide. Mount Zion, the place of the name of the Lord of hosts. Okay, look in your booklet, page 19, this third bullet point. I'm going to give you a potted history of Cush and Egypt and why it's important to Isaiah. So Cush has a plan to get help from Assyria to conquer Egypt. So Cush is on the south of Egypt, Assyria is on the north. Cush fancies the fertile Nile River and Delta region and says, Assyria, all I need you to do is hit the north and I'll hit the south and we'll totally make sport of the whole lot of them. You know, this ancient Pharaoh kingdom will wipe them right out. So the result would be so overwhelming that little Judah would be able to help take over Egyptian towns. But God is still and silent. He's watching from his mountain and he's saying, I'm just watching this one. Shebna of Ethiopia and Cush did invade and conquer Egypt, and he did make an agreement with Assyria to share the sway of Middle East between them. So he says, look, we're way to the south, we're out of your reach, Assyria, we'll have the south, and you're way up in the north, we're not going to mess with you, you be the north. So they said, we'll divide it between us. Judah supplied soldiers and settlers to move into Egypt after it was defeated and settle. So several Egyptian towns at this time were filled with Jewish people, Jewish worship, and God invites Egypt to make the most of this and receive him as their God, but they don't. Instead, God announces that Ethiopia and Egypt are both going to fail in their attempt to reign in Assyria. Egypt under Sabaka's son, Shebna, tried to attack Assyria but was decisively defeated. After that, it was only a matter of time before Assyria actually invaded Egypt and took it over themselves in 671-677 BC. So God says, look, here's your chance in Egypt to learn the lesson Pharaoh never learned in the Exodus, to turn and know me. Listen. When there's a big trumpet, you listen. When there's a big fire on a mountain, you look. That's the plan. This is all going to happen, and this will be the warning to you. Everybody should make the most of that, but in the end, you're just going to be like all the south is just going to be like trees that were harvested, but then they're just only really good for animals afterwards. And God says that Cush and Egypt and Israel are going to have, Judah, going to have a bit of interactions and emissaries and exchanges of information and things. So now we go to Egypt, chapter 19. So an oracle concerning Egypt. Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. The idols of Egypt are all going to tremble when he comes at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. And I will stir up Egyptians against Egyptians. And they're all going to fight each against each other, and everybody against their own neighbour. City against city, kingdom against kingdom. And the spirit of the Egyptians within them are going to be emptied out. And I will confound their counsel. They will inquire of their idols and sorcerers and mediums and necromancers, and I will give over the Egyptians to the hands of a hard master. A fierce king is going to rule over them, declares the Lord of hosts. Then the waters of the sea will be dried up, and the river will be dry and parched, and its canals are going to become foul. The branches of Egypt's Nile are going to diminish and dry up. Reeds and rushes will rot away. There will be famine places by the Nile on the brink of it. And all that is sown by the Nile is going to be parched and driven away and will be no more. Fishermen will mourn and lament, and everybody who throws their hook into the Nile will languish, everybody who spreads nets on the water. The workers in combed flax are going to despair, the weavers of white cotton, those who are the pillars of the land are going to be crushed, and all those who work for pay are going to be grieved. The princes of Zoan are utterly foolish. The wisest counselors of Pharaoh give stupid counsel. How can you say to Pharaoh, I'm the son of a wise, the son of ancient kings? Where then are your wise men? Let them tell you that they might know what the Lord of gods of hosts has purposed against Egypt. Every princes of Zoan have become fools, and the princes of Memphis are deluded. Those who are the cornerstones of her tribes have made Egypt stagger. The Lord has mingled within her a spirit of confusion, and they will make Egypt stagger in all its deeds, as a drunken man staggers in his own sick. There will be nothing for Egypt that head or tail, palm branch or reed may do. And in that day, Egyptians will be like women. They will tremble with fear before the hand that the Lord of hosts shakes over them, and the land of Judah will become a terror to the Egyptians. Everyone to whom it is mentioned will fear because of the purpose that the Lord of hosts has purposed against them. And in that day there will be 5 cities in the land of Egypt that speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to the Lord of hosts. One of these will be called the city of destruction, possibly the city of the sun. In that day there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord at its border. It will be a sign and a witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. And when they cry to the Lord because of their oppressors, he is going to send them a saviour and a defender and deliver them. And the Lord will make himself known to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians will know the Lord in that day and worship with sacrifice and offering. And they will make vows to the Lord and perform them. And the Lord will strike Egypt, striking and healing. And they will return to the Lord, and he will listen to their pleas for mercy and heal them. In that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria. Assyria will come into Egypt, Egypt will go into Assyria, the Egyptians will worship with the Assyrians, and in that day Israel will be the third, with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, Blessed be Egypt my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel my inheritance.
Does this God disapprove of Egyptian sun worship? Because in the King James it doesn't actually mention that goddess Asherah at all. It just says the groves. And then I'm looking at, so that was back in
17 verse 8 it was.
Yeah. And then on to 19 you've just done, it goes on about their idols, and presumably, you know, the sun worshipping aspect of idols. Does that fit into it at all? Is it sort of...
well, the oracle concerning Damascus, where it says, he will not look to the, verse 8 of chapter 17 that is, he will not look to the altars, the work of his hands, he will not look on what his own fingers have made, either the Asherim or the altars of incense.
Because they've got all the images in the King James, and then a translation note that might mean sun images, and then that would be Asherah, wouldn't it? The goddess, sun goddess.
Yes, and that's the Assyrian or Damascene idol pantheon.
But presumably, any kind of worshipping of the sun, the star sun, is considered idolatry.
Yes, yeah, basically. So the idolatry it mentions here. What verse is it in chapter 19? I've lost it.
When he says just in general the Egyptians against idols. The first one, 19:1. Swift clouds shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence. So like throwing them away. That's the King James version. I don't know what you've got on I've got both here.
Yeah, it's interesting. In verse 18 of chapter 19, it says, In that day there will be 5 cities in the land of Egypt that speak the language of Canaan, swear allegiance to the Lord of hosts, and one of these is going to be called the city of destruction.
Yeah.
That's what the Dead Sea Scroll says. That's what the Septuagint records. But the Dead Sea Scroll and some other manuscripts say one of these will be called the City of the Sun.
Yeah, heresy. Yeah. I wonder if that's where heresy comes from, because in the note here it says, or of heresy.
There'll be a common Greek root to it, but that won't be where the...
Yeah, I've got the City of Destruction in the translation of the Sun, like you say.
So, it could be a wordplay even, that City of Destruction was one way of saying it, and City of the Sun is another. So we've covered the history of how Jewish people, Jewish settlers, went into Egypt and settled the land as when it was overthrown by the Ethiopian kings, and that's partly the first sort of fulfilment of this promise that somehow there'll be God worship in Egypt of all places, and that will happen. Nowadays, or in fact ever since the first few centuries after Jesus, the Egyptians took up the gospel very favourably, and so did the Assyrians. So the Assyrian church was and is still a strong part of Eastern Orthodox communion of churches, and the Coptic Orthodox Church is the Egyptian one. So there are 2 main groups of people living in Egypt at the moment. There are ethnic Egyptians who are descended from the people from this time, and Arabs, who are the majority by far. So the Arabic conquest of Egypt in the centuries around about Muhammad's time mean that probably 85-90% of the people living in Egypt are Arabic now, but the Coptic population is still resolutely very Christian and extremely independent, and in a lot of ways people still see a great deal of fulfillment for this text in how strong the the Coptic and Assyrian Orthodox churches are, because they are whole ethnic groups that gave themselves up to Christianity forever, basically, and still are. They've got new pressure now, especially in the Assyrian Orthodox Church, which has been heavily persecuted by ISIS, Daesh in recent times. But on they go. Interesting. Any more questions or things to say about this text?
I have one about Moab that I didn't get to ask.
Okay.
If that's all right to read one.
Do pipe up
It's
with
just,
questions. I'd rather you all
in
ask.
Leviticus and my Bible in a year, it just struck me cool with me. When it says at the very beginning when we started the debate that they haven't had to, but it says that they've reacted by having, well, I don't know if did they do it as a sign of defeat when they've got their heads bald and their beard cut off? Because in Leviticus, God is actually saying you mustn't shave off the corner of your beard and stuff like that.
That's right. It's a symbol of shame too. Like Job, right? So it's the disaster happens, and one of the things he does is he shaves himself with broken pottery, and he scratches all his scabs off, and he sits in ashes, and he just cries aloud. That is a cultural expression of grief and sorrow for a catastrophe like that of loss. So.
Apparently, when the Egyptians lost a cat in a house fire, they'd shave their eyebrows off. Interesting one. Because they revered cats. But yeah, Moab is not the same. I just imagined it was to do with shame.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, definitely. That really is the right note to have in terms of what God is saying about these countries, because what he's saying is that you've been proud, you've been ever so strong, and you've managed to be independent for such a long time, and it's given you a reason to trust in your own arrogance. But I'm telling you that whatever you trust in, if it's not me, it's going to go. And all of these ancient kingdoms are completely digested by future powers. You know, we've seen the rhythm of Babylon, then Persia, then Greece, then Rome. That's just what happens. You know, they never really rise up again afterwards. I mean, Egypt finds a new way of being Egypt after this. But yeah, Alexander the Great just sweeps in and wipes it right out and conquers it completely. And then Rome's just like, well, we'll have that, and conquers it completely. And you know, later on, the Arabs take it as well, and they say, right, we'll have that and conquer it completely. So the multiple fulfillment thing, there's a cyclical or cyclical nature to a lot of history, especially where ethnic tensions are concerned. You know, there's many places in the world where, because of ethnic reasons, countries just cannot get along. And lots of them are this old, you know, 3,000 years ago it all started when they moved into that valley, and my granddad's granddad got pushed out into the neighbouring river plain, and ever since then, every year we bring up a little rock and we chuck it in. There are territorial disputes all over the world, but one of the most amusing ones is a little tiny rock in the sea, which is claimed by both Canada and Denmark as part of Greenland. And every year, Denmark takes a bottle of Danish schnapps and a flag and plants it on the island in the snow. And every year, Canada sends a boat up and leaves a bottle of Canadian whiskey and a Canadian flag up there instead. And they basically, that's them doing that. They've done that for years, like decades. Wow. But every year they just leave this little present to say, get you next time. Have a present. It's our flag and a bottle of our favourite drink. But many other things like that are desperately, desperately scary. So there's islands in the Western Pacific region that are claimed by sometimes 3 or 4 countries. You know, the South China Sea is a prime example. And, you know, missiles will be fired. You know, jets and drones are circling all the time. Destroyers and aircraft carrier fleets are all in there just because of these arguments. And what Isaiah says is that God sees all of that. You know, he sees the argument that you have about who controls which bit of land. And he's telling you that if that's where your hope is, it's bound to fail. You know, even if you trust in the thing about geographic Israel, you know, or the kingdom of David, no point. Gonna go eventually. The only thing that will still be there when all that stops is God. So that's who you need to be in touch with.
I thought 14 seems quite like full on. Where it says,
1914 is that?
Yeah, where it says like the Lord hath mingled a perverse spirit
Yep.
in the midst thereof, and they have cursed Egypt forever in every work thereof, as a drunken man staggereth in his vomit.
Yeah. So basically, who has the ultimate power over countries that rise and countries that fall? It's God.
Yeah.
You know, the whole reason why Israelite monotheism is so different to every other religion that has ever been, you know, at this point, is that they say there is one God who controls all the nations. You know, he controls our friends and he controls our enemies. And if it happens, then it means he's let it happen. And nothing that happens can break the territory he delineates for it. So we worship God who made not only our country and our people, but all countries and all people and everything, and stars and suns and skies and everything. So when Israelite monotheism is sort of established as part of Israel as a kingdom, you know, it really is unique. There's nobody else saying this in those days. Nobody else says there's one God that made all the world and underpins all the risings and fallings of all the nations. All the other gods and things are all our gods, you know, not your gods. Maybe if your God wins, then we'll borrow it and have our own version of it, like the Romans did with the Greeks. Oh, the Greek gods are good, let's copy them all.
That line reminds me of the Tower of Babel a bit. The Lord hath mingled a perverse spirit. It's a bit like he confounds all the peoples of the earth.
Yeah, sort of muddles their speech
Yeah.
and makes them, where they used to be all together, now they're all split up and like they're drunk.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny how language comes up like that, because it's another one is like Pentecost, where God comes and gets them to speak in tongues, and everybody, it's like reverse Babel, isn't it? Yeah, everybody hears it in their own language and everybody understands. Let's push on. 20, a sign against Egypt and Cush. So this speaks to a time when Cush is going to have conquered Egypt and thought it's been ever so clever because of you know, whoever's trying to avoid Assyria is going to put their trust in Cush, and Isaiah says they're both wrong. Excuse me. So chapter 20 verse 1, in that year the commander-in-chief, who was sent by Sargon, the king of Assyria, he came to Ashdod and fought against it and captured it. At that time the Lord spoke by Isaiah the son of Amos, saying, "Go and loose the sackcloth from your waist and take your sandals off from your feet." And he did so, walking around naked and barefoot. And the Lord said, "In the same way my servant Isaiah walks naked and barefoot for 3 years as a sign and portent against Egypt and Cush, so shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptian captives and the Cushite exiles, both young and old, naked and barefoot, with buttocks uncovered, the nakedness of Egypt. They will all be dismayed and ashamed because of Cush their hope and because of Egypt their boast. The inhabitants of the coastland will say in that time, Behold, this is what happens to those in whom we hoped and to whom we fled for help to be delivered from the king of Assyria. And we, how can we escape?" So Isaiah does a piece of scary performance art for which we would doubtlessly try and get him sectioned under the Mental Health Act today. Walking around 3 years, naked and barefoot, telling everybody that this thing that's obviously happened is going to unhappen because of what God has said to him. Ranting around like a crazy person. So Isaiah says, well, the same way I'm walking around with my butt uncovered for 3 years, that's what everybody who trusts in Egypt and Cush are going to have to do when Assyria does take them. Because although they look now like they're not going to be troubled by Assyria, they sure will be, because this is what God has decided they're going to lose.
That's really powerful in the Adam and Eve context, isn't it? When God uses nakedness
Yeah.
in that way. And you think
Yeah.
back to being banished out of Eden, it sort of strikes us interestingly.
Yeah, undoubtedly it comes with all those illusions that
Yeah.
God was the one that covered the nakedness and the shame of the people. And now he says, because you've put all your trust in your own nations, I'm going to uncover you. I'm going to make you be shamed again, like you were embarrassed back then. You're going to have that kind of primal, first thing, almost toddler-like association with sin and guilt. Because you think you've been so smart, but you sure haven't. It is amazing, isn't it? I mean, nobody who reads this without a study like this is going to understand what is going on. Nobody knows this history except people who study it. Isn't it weird how so much of the Bible is that way? That we love it and we read it and we want it to speak to us. We have no idea who Sargon is or when Cush ever defeated Egypt. I mean, we're not taught that in schools, are we? We're not really taught it from the pulpit much either. But I think that we have to. We have to educate ourselves, because someone comes along and says the book of Isaiah was the result of a long line of people living over several centuries, and it's like, there's no way a single Isaiah wrote it all. But if you say, nuh-uh, yes it was, sometimes you need a good reason to offer to that person to say, look, I don't accept that. I see that Isaiah mingles references to stuff that happens long after his death in with descriptions of his life. The thing about the Cushite conquest of Egypt, that wasn't really resolved until 100 years after Isaiah had died. But here he is, walking around naked and barefoot, showing everybody it's going to happen, because he's totally, totally sure that it will. And it doesn't happen, like, straight away. He gets to sound crazy for a whole long time before he actually comes through.
Yeah. And he gets to die without it ever coming true.
And so many more things the same. He speaks about stuff that keeps coming true centuries after he dies. And he gets to be thought of as crazy, deluded lunatic the whole time.
What fascinates me is, when did his book and the other books of these prophets, which were railing against the people of Israel, when did they become incorporated in the Israelite scriptures?
It's hard to answer that, because there's no single event. The canon of the Old Testament, say, is in many ways much more flexible than I think Protestant Christians are used to thinking of it. So we say there are 66 books of the Bible, there are 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament, and it's always been that way. Well, it has, but it would be wrong to say that they're the only candidates, and it would be wrong to say there was a really clear point at which it all was agreed. The Jewish Bible is arranged in three main sections: the Torah, the writings, and the prophets. And when each prophet gets added is a very blurry thing. It's just sort of held in esteem by generations of Jewish people, and eventually is sort of gathered together into the text of the prophets. But there are lots of other texts, some of which are even mentioned in the Bible, which are lost to archaeology completely. Some of them are source texts for the books that we now have. And it's kind of organic.
And some of them are apocryphal.
Yes.
The New Testament are quote apocryphal.
Yes, the Old Testament Apocrypha in general are Greek texts. So there's extra bits of Daniel, extra bits of Esther, extra bits of Ezra, there's the Maccabees, there's Judith and Tobit and some other documents. Some of them are still quite, you might look at them and think, yeah, this looks pretty much like the Bible. Can't see any heresy in it. It seems pretty reasonable. Others of them whoa, okay. We're into the across the Rubicon on sanity here, like when Daniel starts feeding the brass god tar cakes or talking to the dragon that lives there. But the point is that the ancient, the real Hebrew text of the Old Testament scriptures was only finished in around about 400 BC. By the time Ezra and the guys are talking about Xerxes and Artaxerxes, that's late. And the question of whether Isaiah was part of that canon at that time is still open. We're not sure. We definitely know by 400 or so that it was. And we definitely know that by the time they write the Septuagint, which is about 200 years before Jesus, that it was. And the copy which is of the Hebrew text, which was discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that is also around about 200 or so BC. So we know that Jewish communities of that time held it as scripture, part of the prophets by then. But it's vague. It's hard to see. We want to have real historical and archaeological confidence in it, but it's actually quite hard to nail it down when it was that Isaiah stopped being this lunatic that we have to saw in half to stop him saying insane things, to being chiefest of all writing prophets, save Moses himself. Must have been hard for them.
Well, it must have been hard for him, I think.
Being sawed to death, yeah, it probably was.
Not an easy gig, that.
Not a nice way to work.
I mean, if you're somebody who, it's not the way you go about getting hard, is it? Going to make it for 2 years. I think you lose all kinds of.
You get ostracized.
Yeah.
I mean, Isaiah especially. Some of the prophets in the Bible are really ordinary. Like Amos, he comes and he's got a prophetic word he has to deliver to the king of Israel. And he says, look, I'm not a prophet. I'm not the son of a prophet. I'm not from the school of the prophets. I'm not like a course-paying theology graduate. I just here because God told me to say something and here it is. Blah. I'm a farmer. You know, I've got some sheep and I've got some sycamore fig trees. That's my earthly wealth. I'm just here because God told me to be here. Whereas Isaiah is a royal counselor. He is a person of massive stature and substance, and he's got to look like a fool above all fools to get this message across. He's got to lose his standing and his status and eventually his life because of all these things that he says. So definitely it's really hard for him the whole time it's happening to have that rebuke. I mean, can you imagine 3 years and not one thing you said would come true happens in those 3 years at all? Doesn't happen till afterwards. That must be awful. Ezekiel goes through something the same, and he's lying naked next to a model he made of Jerusalem. If you walked in on that, you would think this person is certifiable.
And then so on, if the things that they say don't come true, you can stone them.
Yeah. Because that's what Deuteronomy tells them to do.
Yeah.
Because it's like if what a prophet says comes true, then I sent them.
Yeah, and if not...
I didn't send them, you should get rid of them. You shouldn't have any fear of them.
Do you think God held off a little bit, or...?
No, I think what I think is that Isaiah gets these little ones that do come true, which keep him in the game. So he said in the Behold the Son will come text of 7, 8, 9, he said, you know, by the time this baby is 2 or 3 and weaned, the dread that you fear is going to be gone. And I think the fact that he gets to see that come true gives him a little more favour, and everyone would be like, well, he was right about the boy. Yeah. And then he says, you know, within 3 years, this alliance will collapse. And it's like, oh, I'll come talk to you in 3 years then. He comes 3 years later and it's like, all right, you were right about the kingdom and you were right about the boy. But I bet you're not right about this. Or at least we won't kill you straight away. We'll wait. But Isaiah breaks the pattern in the sense that he says things that won't come true for centuries perhaps, and it might be only after those things have all happened that they actually say, all right, fine. I even think it'd be like they had a list of the stuff about Edom and Assyria and Cyrus, and it'd be like, hey, it's happened. I know who Shearush in Isaiah is. It's Cyrus, king of Persia. He's let the exiles back in. He's given us the letters of certification to cross the Euphrates and go back into the province, rebuild this. He was right. It's happened. And that's when they're like, all right, he's part of the Bible. But I wonder if there were people all the way up until then who were like, no, it hasn't come true yet. I'll never believe until it does.
I just thought of Shearush, did you?
Pardon?
I thought it called Cyrus Shearush.
I can't remember the exact transliteration, but the Hebrew names for Babylonians and Persians and Egyptians and stuff always sound a bit different to how the Persians or Assyrians or Egyptians would say it themselves. So, for instance, Xerxes is called Artaxerxes in the Hebrew text of Esther is called Ahasuerus, which is a fair way of describing it, but that text was definitely written when Artaxerxes lived, so that's kind of what we're dealing with. Isaiah mentions Cyrus, the Lord's anointed, who will allow the return of the exile, but it's not 1,000,000% sure whether he wrote that 300 years before it happened, and he's just given a name and it's just turned out to be true. Because people say that is how a Hebrew person would spell Cyrus after they found out Cyrus's name. So maybe this section was written by somebody who's writing in Cyrus's time. That's what the skeptic would say. But the person who believes in the prophetic word of God might say, Isaiah hasn't exactly named him. He's just said, see, this person, my anointed one, will come and will set my captives free. Like, there's no guarantee that he is or isn't talking about a Cyrus of king of Persia that he can see. So both options are valid to say, Isaiah was written by one Isaiah 700 years before Jesus, and this is it all. And some of it he will have understood, like this stuff, and some of it maybe speaks to a circumstance that didn't unfold till 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or 800 years later. I mean, the stuff about the Son is born, and the stuff about Isaiah 53 and 55 and all the rest of it, that the writers of the New Testament look at Jesus and they say, look, this is who it's really all about. Isaiah's text is still coming true today. But for the early chapters of Isaiah, there's an outworking of it in 700 BC, or round about there, that Isaiah is obviously speaking to, and in the second half of Isaiah, there really isn't. You know, it's glimpses of what became a future long after he died. So you could take the cynic route and say, it was just written after the events. We could say, well, look, I genuinely believe, there's no archaeological evidence to suggest that we should ever think of Isaiah as being separate sections or partial sections. Every copy of it that's ever been discovered has been the whole scroll, or at least a piece of it that we recognise as being the middle of it or the end of it. So textually and archaeologically, there's no reason not to believe that he wrote the whole thing. But the reason you would not believe he wrote the whole thing is that you didn't believe that it was possible to prophesy about things 300 years before they happened. So that's where we are with that.
I think the fact that he's there 3 years afterwards, or at that amount of time, with the Jews and with the kind of things that he was prophesying, is testament to the fact that, like you say, they've tested one and they found to be true, so they've naturally left him to it. My struggle is that, the point could have been made in 3 days.
But the thing is, all across charismatic churches, every Sunday, people are bringing bits of prophecy that they've written that they feel is from God and passing it to each other or to the pastor or something, putting it up on their blog. And sometimes the time and place and things specified takes place and we can see that was a word from God, and sometimes the time passes and we can see that it wasn't. And sometimes the prophecy is so vague that you wouldn't be able to tell if it happened or not necessarily. Isaiah gives you all of these. So sometimes he writes to a concrete reality that's going to happen in 3 years, in 2 years. And sure, he didn't have to walk around naked, I don't suppose, for it to still be true. But the question is, if he had just written, I reckon in a few years, king of Egypt and Cush are going to be defeated by Assyria, everyone would be like, well, maybe. But they wouldn't think of it as being special or important. But he has to show everybody how special and important it is, and how true it is, and how sure he is about everything else he said, by this kind of performance art which nails his colours to the mast before it happens. And it's worth noting that unless he does stuff like this, nobody is going to listen to him. Because what Isaiah is saying, in that you can't stop the king of Assyria, it's the hand of God that's doing this, not him, he is not popular. Nobody wants to hear it. That's why they hate him so much. That's why they don't listen to him. They can't argue with stuff like this, because it takes place within timelines that they can experience. but they don't like everything he says.
But isn't that more arrogant of the people? The reason why all this is happening is because they're not doing what God's will is.
They think they are. If you tell somebody who's doing something bad, I think you're doing something bad, what's the first thing they do? Is they self-justify.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they say, yeah, you're probably right. But usually they'll say, no, this is a good idea, come on. And they justify and they self-defend. So telling people that they've committed generations worth of catastrophic idolatry and sin, basically everything they believe about God and their own people is wrong, who's going to want to hear that? Nobody. We don't have very long, so I'd like to finish with chapter... Oh gosh, did I say chapter...
21 next, I think.
We finished chapter 20, didn't we?
Yes.
Yeah, let's go over the page then. We'll go to chapter 21 to chapter 22. I'm going to read it all in one go. The oracle concerning the wilderness of the sea. As whirlwinds in the Negev sweep on, it comes from the wilderness, from a terrible land. A stern vision is told to me. The traitor betrays, the destroyer destroys. Get up, O Elam, lay siege, O Media. All the sighing she has caused I bring to an end. Therefore my loins are filled with anguish. Pangs have seized me like the pangs of a woman in labour. I am bowed down so that I cannot hear. I am dismayed so that I cannot see. I am dismayed so that I cannot see. My heart staggers. Horror has appalled me. The twilight I long for has been turned into trembling. They prepare a table. They spread the rugs. They eat and drink. And arise, O princes, oil the shield. For thus the Lord said to me, go and set a watchman, and let him announce what he sees. When he sees riders and horsemen in pairs, riders on donkeys, riders on camels, let him listen diligently, very diligently. Then he who saw cried out, upon a watchtower I stand, O Lord, continually by day, and at my post I am stationed whole nights. And behold, here come riders, horsemen in pairs, and he answered, fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all the carved images of her gods he has shattered upon the ground. O my threshed and winnowed one, what I have heard from the Lord of hosts, the Lord of Israel, I announce to you. The oracle concerning Dumah. One is calling to me from Seir. Watchman, what time of the night? Watchman, what time of the night? The watchman says, morning comes, and also the night. If you will inquire, inquire. Come back again. The oracle concerning Arabia. In the thickets of Arabia you will lodge, O caravans of the Dedanites. To the thirsty bring water, meet the fugitive with bread, O inhabitants of the land of Tamar. For they have fled from the swords, from the drawn sword, from the bent bow, from the press of battle. And thus the Lord says to me, but within a year, declares according to the years of a hired worker, that's like a big season, all the glory of Kedar will come to an end, and the remainder of the archers of the mighty men of the sons of Kedar will be few, for the Lord God of Israel has spoken. 22. The oracle concerning the valley of vision. What do you mean that you've gone up, all of you, to the housetops, you who are full of shouting? Tumultuous city, exultant town, your slain aren't slain with the sword or dead in battle. All your leaders have fled together. Without the bow they were captured. All of you who were found were captured, though they had fled far away. And therefore I said, look away from me. Let me weep bitter tears. Do not labour to comfort me concerning the destruction of the daughter of my people. For the Lord God of hosts has a day of tumult and trampling and confusion in the valley of vision, a battering down of walls and a shouting of mountains. And Elam bore the quiver with chariots and horsemen, and Kir uncovered the shield. Your choicest valleys were full of chariots. Your horsemen took their stand at the gates, and he has taken away the covering of Judah. In that day you looked to the weapons of the house of the forest, and you saw that the breaches of the city of David were many. You collected the waters of the lower pool, and you counted the houses of Jerusalem. And you broke down the houses to fortify the wall. You have made a reservoir in between two walls for the water of the old pool, but you did not look to him who did it, or see him who planned it long ago. In that day the Lord of God of hosts called for weeping and mourning, baldness and sackcloth wearing. Behold, joy and gladness, killing oxen and slaughtering sheep, eating flesh and drinking wine. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. The Lord of hosts has revealed himself to my ears. Surely this iniquity will not be atoned for until you die, says the Lord God of hosts. Thus says the Lord God of hosts, come, go to this steward, to Shebna, who is over the household, and say to him, What have you to do here, and what have you here that you have cut out here a tomb for yourself? You've chopped out a tomb on the height and carved a dwelling for yourself in the rock. Behold, the Lord is going to hurl you away violently, O you strong man. He will seize firm hold of you and whirl you around and around and around, and then throw you like a ball into a far field. There you shall die, and there you shall be your glorious chariots, you shame of your master's house. I'm going to thrust you from your office, and you'll be pulled down from your station. In that day I will call upon my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and I will clothe him with your robe, and I will bind your sash upon him. And I will commit your authority to his hand. And he instead will be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the house of Judah. And I'm going to place on his shoulder the keys of the house of David. He shall open and none shall shut. He shall shut and no one shall open. I'm going to fasten him like a peg in a secure place. And he will become a throne of honor to his father's house. And they will hang upon him the whole honor of his father's house, the offspring and issue, every small vessel, from the cups to the flagons. And in that day, declares the Lord of hosts, the peg that was fastened in a secure place will give way, and it will be cut down and fall, and the load that was tied to it will be chopped off, for the Lord has spoken. So, some bullet points. 21 verses 1 to 10 is a lament for Babylon, which was defeated by Sennacherib and Assyria in that time, around about 703 BC. But the speaker is not really Isaiah, who told everyone not to turn to Babylon, but to accept Assyrian power, but to Shebna, the king's shifty advisor. So 21 verse 1 to 10 says, oh no, Babylon's dead. But Isaiah's like, well, obviously. But it's Shebna who's announcing to the kingdom and saying, oh, by the way, everybody, it's really sad because Babylon's gone. Now, Isaiah's the one that contradicts him and said, oh, by the way, Shebna, you yourself are going to lose your office and God's going to cast you out. And he's going to put the kind of government of Israel onto Eliakim's shoulder. And that's going to keep working out all the way until Babylon does fall. In fact, until Babylon destroys Judah. So by 22 verse 4, Shebna realizes the disastrous nature of his policy. His policy is to try and fight Assyria wherever he can. And he sees the gathering army from every corner of the region marching against Jerusalem. Time to mend the defences and prepare for the siege, he thinks. Jerusalem was in no shape to withstand a siege, and the revelry, celebrations, is foolish. The royal court realizes their grave error, and Shebna is fired and replaced with Eliakim. So what happens is Sennacherib marches on the whole countryside, and he totally defeats the northern kingdom. He's the one that sacks Samaria and basically resigns it to the dustbin of history. But he marches all the way to Jerusalem, and Shebna, who's been saying, let's fight Assyria, has been telling everybody, yeah, we'll fight Assyria, party! But everyone realises that this is no battle they can win. It'd be like, it's like, I don't know, Crimea getting invaded by Russia. It's that ridiculous. There's no way we can fight back against this. There's nothing we've got that will possibly turn it back. What we have to do is throw ourselves on the mercy of God, which is what Isaiah tells everyone to do, and then we'll survive. But if we don't, then we won't. So we can't fight them. Good. That is it for this week. Next week we're going to be looking at Isaiah chapters 23 up to 20... I think up to 33 actually. What will be 23 to 33? No, there's another section. We'll go up to 20. Go up to 30, I think. I'll clarify it on. I've got the. Oh, actually, I have it here. Let me just look for it. I'll tell you.
Have you got the notes by any chance?
I don't have them here, but I'll link you a link to it, and you can print your own off if you want. Okay. Tires for. So go up to 27. Yeah, just 23 to 27 next week. There's a lot that happens and a lot to study, but the chapters are really, really long. These ones are all a bit short, but they're really long, so there's plenty to cover. Good. Good. Thank you so much, everybody, and well done.
Yeah, bless you. Thank you.